I was just reading. Literally, just sitting there with my nose buried in a book I didn't even care about. One of those hardcover mysteries stacked at the far corner of the bookstore where nobody bothers to look. My backpack leaned against my leg, half-zipped, the hum of fluorescent lights washing over me like a steady, forgettable pulse. And then she appeared. She wasn't loud or deliberately attention-grabbing. She was confident, the kind of presence that somehow rearranges the air around you without trying. Mid-40s, I guessed, with hair pulled back in a practical twist and an expression that suggested she knew things most people didn't. She was leaning against the counter, thumbs brushing against her phone, scanning the shelves like she had all the time in the world, and maybe she did. I tried to focus back on the page, but then she said something. "Excuse me, do you know if this author ever writes anything other than mysteries?" Her voice was warm, but not soft, like she didn't need anyone's permission to be heard. My stomach knotted, not because I was nervous around strangers normally, but because my eyes kept flicking to her without permission. I shrugged, muttering, I think mostly mysteries." Her lips tilted, a quick, knowing smile, the kind that made it clear she'd heard far better answers, but was okay with my clumsy one. Then she leaned just slightly closer than necessary, elbows resting on the counter, a subtle proximity that made the hairs on my arms prickle. My book felt heavier in my hands. I glanced up again, and she was watching me, not in a predatory way, not at all, but like she was trying to map out who I was, maybe from the curve of my eyebrows, the way I chewed on the corner of a page. I immediately looked back down, pretending the words meant something, but I wasn't reading. Not really. She chuckled, softly, shaking her head at something that wasn't even funny. And then, then, she leaned over to reach for a copy of another book, brushing her fingers almost against mine. It was so brief, so incidental, and yet, I could still feel it, that tiny spark, like static electricity dancing between us. My hand tensed, and I could swear my pulse did a weird little flip. "You're younger than you look," she said, almost to herself, almost like an observation meant to float into the air, not a comment directed at me. I froze, my brain scrambling. Younger than I look? I wasn't even sure what that meant, but the way she said it, her voice low and thoughtful, made it impossible to not notice. She stood straight again, tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, and for a second, she just waited. Not for me, exactly, but maybe for something. And I caught myself hoping she wasn't going anywhere. I returned to my book, or tried to, but every line blurred into one question. Why had she leaned so close, so naturally, as if proximity alone could tell a story? I couldn't stop thinking about the brief, warm weight of her hand near mine, the small tilt of her smile, the way her presence made the store feel impossibly smaller, impossibly intimate. And I knew, before I even wanted to admit it to myself, that I'd replay that tiny, accidental closeness again and again, over coffee, over fluorescent light, over pages that suddenly seemed unreadable. Something had sparked, something unspoken, and I had no idea how to reach it, or if I even should. I didn't expect to see her again that week. The bookstore had been quiet, the smell of paper and dust hanging in the air, and I'd convinced myself our encounter was a fluke, just a brief, misplaced spark in the fluorescent glow. But then she walked in again, leaning slightly against the doorway, a tote slung over her shoulder. "You're here a lot," she said, half teasing, half curious. Her voice didn't demand an answer, but it landed on me anyway. I felt my ears heat up and gave a shrug I hoped looked casual. This time, she was looking for something very specific, a first edition of some obscure poetry collection. I offered to help. I wasn't sure why. Maybe because I wanted to prolong proximity. Maybe because her presence made the air itself feel sharper, more alive. She let me lead, moving down aisles in silence that wasn't uncomfortable exactly, just waited. Her eyes flicked over shelves, lingering on spines like she was scanning for a memory as much as a book. Occasionally, she would hum quietly, a short, almost shy sound that somehow cut through the monotony of paper and dust. I noticed her hands, long, deliberate fingers brushing over the worn edges of books, careful not to damage them, but unconsciously revealing a meticulousness that seemed to mirror her life. Controlled, measured, cautious. I watched her laugh at something she read on a spine. A brief flash of light that didn't reach her eyes completely, but I caught the shadow of exhaustion in them. Tiredness that maybe wasn't just from work. She paused near the poetry section, glancing at a shelf as if weighing some impossible decision. Then she looked up at me, eyes narrowing slightly, and for the first time I saw hesitation, not the casual pause of indecision, but something more fragile. A guarded glance, like she wasn't sure if letting me in, even a little, was safe. I wanted to say something. Anything. But all I managed was, this one maybe, holding a small hardcover out to her. Her fingers brushed mine as she took it, and the contact lingered just a fraction longer than necessary. That fraction left me breathless in a way that felt both thrilling and precarious. She smiled then, soft, almost apologetic, and whispered, "Thank you." Not in the polite, surface-level way, but in a way that sounded like it was meant for no one else, a private acknowledgment. She adjusted her tote, shifted her weight, and I sensed the wall she carried with her. Confident, layered, and immovable for the most part. Yet I could see cracks. In the way her shoulders slumped for a second. In the pause before she spoke. In the quiet vulnerability she didn't fully hide. And I wanted to explore it, not because I could fix anything, but because it existed, because she existed, and I couldn't look away. We walked toward the counter together, the book between us now a silent conduit. I didn't say anything, and neither did she. But there was a weight in the shared space. The gentle pull of forbidden energy that hovered in our quiet, in the close brush of hands, in the way our eyes sometimes met and quickly looked away. When she finally stepped back to leave, I realized I was holding my breath. And she, for her part, hesitated at the door, just long enough to glance over her shoulder, offering the smallest, charged smile that promised neither anything nor nothing. And that, more than anything, was all I needed to carry me home, replaying it endlessly. The hesitant warmth, the almost touch, the quiet invitation to something unspoken. The rain had started just as I locked up my bike outside her apartment building. The streets gleamed with reflected streetlights, puddles forming little mirrors at my feet. She'd invited me inside to dry off, and I, against all rational thought, had said yes. Her apartment smelled faintly of brewed coffee and old books, a mixture that somehow felt like her. Warm but layered, comfortable but deliberate. She handed me a towel with one hand, the other holding a mug that steamed between her fingers. She didn't say anything, just studied me the way someone studies a page, silently weighing my presence. I wanted to ask her about the way her laugh sometimes faltered, or the way her shoulders seemed heavier than they should be for someone who carried herself so confidently. But the words lodged in my throat. Instead, I hung the towel over a chair and tried not to stare as she moved around the small kitchen, barefoot, hair falling loose in a way she never let anyone see outside her apartment. The storm pounded against the windows, an erratic rhythm that seemed to echo my pulse. I realized we were closer than usual, standing just a step apart, the air between us thick with tension. I could feel her warmth without her touching me, and yet she didn't move closer. Not exactly. Not yet. She poured coffee into 2 mugs and held one out. "You always drink it black?" she asked. Not a casual question. Something about her tone made it impossible to answer casually. I nodded. Yeah. A silence settled in. Comfortable on the surface, electric underneath. My hand brushed hers as I took the mug, and she didn't pull away. I froze, conscious of how wrong, or maybe right, it felt to linger in that fraction of contact. Then the phone rang. She glanced at it, the expression on her face tightening ever so slightly. "It's nothing," she said, but I heard it in her hesitation. An ex, a work call, a friend she wasn't expecting. The moment stretched, fragile and brittle, as she stepped back to answer. I watched her go, and my chest ached in a way I couldn't quite name. My hands gripped the mug too tightly, knuckles whitening, but I stayed where I was. I wanted to follow her, to cross that invisible line, but some part of me, the part that could still recognize boundaries, the part that feared ruining everything, froze. When she returned, she offered a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Sorry," she said. "Nothing important." But her shoulders were different, slumped a little, the kind of tired slump that tells someone's carrying weight they're not ready to share. I thought about leaning in, letting her see that I saw it, that I saw her exhaustion, her guardedness, the flickers of vulnerability she let no one else see. My body wanted to close the distance, to fill the space between us with something more than polite conversation. Instead, I stayed still, sipped the coffee, tried to focus on the steam curling into the air, tried not to let my gaze linger too long, tried not to imagine what it would feel like if we let our hands meet again, this time intentionally. She moved closer, closer than necessary to reach for a book on the shelf, her fingers brushing mine again in that fleeting, accidental way that left a heat behind. I didn't pull away. Neither did she. And then the door buzzed, her intercom. She startled slightly, stepping back, snapping the moment like a twig. I stood frozen, heart hammering. The almost things, the unspoken confessions, the near action, suspended between us, unresolved. I left that night replaying every millisecond. Her warmth, her hesitation, the faint brush of fingers. Nothing had happened, and yet everything had shifted. We were sitting on the worn leather couch in her apartment, the same one I'd claimed a corner of weeks ago without asking. The storm had passed, leaving the city slick and quiet outside. For once, the hum of fluorescent lights was gone. Only the soft ticking of a clock and the faint hiss of traffic in the distance filled the room. She leaned back, hands clasped over her knees, and for a long moment, didn't speak. I wanted to break the silence, to say something meaningless, just to fill the space between us, but I couldn't. My chest felt too tight, my mind too aware of the electricity in the air. Finally, she spoke, not looking at me, but at some point on the wall that didn't exist. "Do you ever wonder why we do this?" I blinked. "Do what?" She exhaled slowly, almost as if the question had been years in the making. "This, whatever this is. Sitting here, talking, being close without, I don't know, without saying what we mean, without pretending we're normal." Her voice wasn't angry or teasing. It was fragile, raw, like she'd stripped herself bare just to ask that one question. And I realized I'd been pretending too, pretending that all these moments, the near touch, the shared silences, the brush of fingers, were insignificant, nothing more than coincidence. But they weren't. Not anymore. I wanted to answer, to say something smart, something that would untangle the tension. But every word I could think of sounded wrong, too loud, too permanent. So I stayed silent, just watched her, noticing how her shoulders slumped a little, how her hands twitched when she clasped them tighter. How beautiful she was in a way that had nothing to do with looks, and everything to do with this fragile honesty she'd finally let me see. "Sometimes," she continued, voice low, "I think maybe I shouldn't care. Maybe I shouldn't." Her sentence broke off, unfinished. She glanced at me then, eyes wide and vulnerable, like she'd been waiting for me to catch her before she fell. I leaned forward, careful not to crowd her, careful not to ruin the delicate space we'd finally admitted existed. I don't know," I said honestly, my own voice barely above a whisper. "But I feel it too." Her gaze dropped, lingering on her mug, on the rim, on the table between us. The room felt impossibly small, impossibly private, as if the rest of the world had disappeared and left only the weight of what we hadn't said. She sighed, a long, soft sound, and in that moment, I saw the conflict etched into every line of her face. Desire, fear, confusion, the memory of choices she hadn't undone, the consequences she carried like invisible chains. We sat like that for minutes I couldn't count. No one moved. No one spoke. The storm outside was gone, but inside, everything was trembling. And then she whispered, almost to herself, almost to the air, maybe I'm too old for this. Maybe I've waited too long to feel seen again." I swallowed, a lump forming in my throat, realizing that silence had said more than words ever could. That confession, hanging between us like smoke, was devastating in its honesty and terrifying in its implications. I wanted to reach for her, I wanted to say something that might fix it, might ease the ache. But I didn't. I only sat there, feeling the impossible weight of her words, knowing that whatever we were, we could no longer pretend it wasn't real. I hadn't expected her to open the drawer. She didn't even look at me when she did it, just slid it open and let her fingers hover over a stack of papers like she wasn't sure she wanted to touch them. I knew instinctively that this wasn't casual. The quiet reverence in her posture, the way her breath hitched ever so slightly, told me this was something she hadn't shared with anyone. I don't usually, she started, her voice faltering, then stopped, biting the inside of her cheek. Finally, she picked up a folded letter, yellowed at the edges, and traced the writing with a finger as though memorizing it all over again. I lost someone, she said, eyes downcast, voice almost disappearing into the room. A long time ago, someone I never got over. I didn't know what to say. The room felt heavier, somehow, charged with the memory she'd unleashed simply by letting me see this sliver of her past. Her hands shook slightly as she held the letter, and for a moment, I realized she wasn't the untouchable, confident woman I'd first noticed in the bookstore. She was human, fragile, carrying heartbreak she'd tucked away so carefully no one would stumble across it. I wanted to reach for her hand, but I didn't. Instead, I sat quietly, letting her know I was there without intruding. I noticed the way her shoulders sagged when she spoke, the faint tremor in her jaw, the way her eyes seemed to weigh every word, every memory. I didn't want anyone to see this, she admitted. Not really. Not even me, some days. Her confession didn't demand an answer, and I couldn't give one anyway. I only nodded, letting the silence stretch, letting her grief breathe in the room like smoke. Then, almost reflexively, I remembered something she'd said months ago, a stray comment about how certain music reminded her of people she couldn't get back. Without thinking, I mentioned a song, one she'd told me in passing she loved, one her late partner used to play. Her head snapped up, eyes wide, glistening. How did you know? I shrugged, awkward, heart hammering. You told me once. I didn't forget. She swallowed, gaze dropping to the letter again. And for the first time, I saw her hesitate in a new way, not just guarded or careful, but exposed, unshielded. It was terrifying and beautiful. Her lips quivered as if she were trying to say something, and then stopped. I realized then that this small revelation, this fragile acknowledgment of loss, had shifted something between us. The walls she'd built weren't gone, but they were thinner, permeable, like light sneaking through a crack in a door. She finally folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the drawer, and lingered over it a moment longer than necessary. Then she looked at me, really looked at me, and whispered something that almost broke me. I didn't think anyone could see me like this. And now, I don't know if I can go back to not being seen. Her words hovered in the air, fragile and trembling, and I felt the room tilt around me, like the world had rearranged itself silently while I wasn't looking. Nothing dramatic, nothing shouted, just a subtle seismic shift in the space between us, in the way we would both remember this moment for years. I stayed still, breathing, letting her hold that weight, and silently acknowledged that nothing would ever be the same after this. The cafe was nearly empty when I saw her again. Rain had left the streets wet and reflective, and the dim light inside painted everything in soft amber. She was already there, seated at a corner table, elbows resting on the wood, hands wrapped around a mug. I hesitated at the door for a second, part of me still unsure if I belonged in her quiet orbit. She looked up and smiled, that small, careful smile that carried everything we hadn't said yet. I slid into the seat across from her. No words at first, just the hum of the espresso machine, the clink of spoons against cups, and the shared rhythm of our breathing. I wasn't sure you'd come, she murmured, eyes flicking to mine, then back down to her mug. There was no accusation in her voice, only a quiet acknowledgment, a recognition of everything we'd navigated to get here. I shrugged, more to myself than to her. I didn't think I could stay away. Her hands tightened around the mug for a moment, knuckles whitening, then relaxed. She let out a soft exhale. I didn't know if I should let you in, she said. But her voice trailed, unfinished, and that ellipsis carried the weight of months of hesitation. I didn't fill it in. I didn't need to. We both knew. The air between us had shifted countless times, in bookstores, in her apartment, on stormy nights. Every accidental brush of hands, every lingering glance, every unspoken confession had led us here. We talked, quietly, about ordinary things, the cafe's new pastry, a book she'd started reading, the lingering chill outside. Nothing monumental, nothing that would have mattered if it were anyone else. But with her, even small words felt charged, meaningful. At some point, the conversation paused. I noticed her hand inch closer to mine across the table, a subtle movement she seemed barely conscious of. I didn't move first, letting her make the choice. And when our fingers brushed, lightly, almost hesitantly, it was enough. A small, deliberate acknowledgment, a seal on something that had been growing in silence. She looked at me, eyes soft, steady, and in them I saw relief, recognition, and something deeper, trust, maybe, or the quiet thrill of finally letting someone see you without pretense. I reached across, letting our fingers intertwine fully this time, a gentle confirmation of the connection that neither of us had dared to name. We stayed like that, sitting together in the muted hum of the cafe, hands linked, bodies relaxed but aware. No declarations, no promises, just the understanding that this was real and that it didn't need to be shouted to exist. The sun outside was waning, light filtering through rain-specked windows, casting gold and gray across her hair. I leaned back slightly, and she leaned her forehead just a fraction against mine, a small, human gesture that spoke of everything: patience, longing, forgiveness, and quiet inevitability. We didn't speak for a long while. No words could improve on the simplicity of that closeness. And when I finally did, it was with a whisper of acknowledgment, not proclamation. "We'll figure it out." She nodded, eyes closing for a moment, hands still laced with mine. No more tension, no more hesitation, just a quiet finality, earned and gentle, like something that had been waiting all along, finally settling into place. I still remember that first day I saw her in the bookstore, how the world seemed to tilt just slightly when she leaned too close, when her fingers brushed mine by accident. Or maybe it wasn't an accident. At the time, I thought it was curiosity, or maybe just polite friendliness. But looking back now, I see it was something more. Something patient, slow, quiet. We weren't perfect. We weren't young, careless, or unscarred. She carried years of experience, memories she'd tucked away, losses she hadn't fully forgiven herself for. And I carried a restlessness, a hunger for someone to see me, to notice me beyond the surface. It took months, small moments, near misses, and unspoken confessions for us to understand each other. And even then, we almost didn't. But what changed wasn't sudden. It wasn't fireworks or grand declarations. It was in the quiet, how I learned to wait, how she learned to trust, how a brush of hands could say more than words ever could, how a shared silence could be louder than a shout. I saw her vulnerability, yes, but I also saw her strength. The woman who could carry grief and still offer kindness, who could hesitate without hesitation, who could finally let someone in without losing herself. And I changed too. I learned restraint, patience, and the kind of listening that doesn't just hear words but notices everything around them. The tension in a shoulder, the flicker of a smile, the exhaustion behind a confident posture. I learned that being seen isn't about attention, it's about acknowledgment. And that sometimes, love isn't sudden or dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet, slow, earned. We never rushed. We never pretended we were perfect for each other. We just existed together in ways that felt honest, in ways that made space for mistakes, for pauses, for growth. I think that's what makes it real. Not the stolen touches or fleeting glances, though they mattered deeply. But the spaces in between, the waiting, the quiet understanding. And now, when I think of her, I think of warmth without pressure, of closeness without pretense, of a kind of love that feels impossible to fake, because it wasn't built on words alone. It was built on presence, patience, and seeing each other as we truly are. I can't go back and change the moments we almost lost, the silences that stretched too long, or the nights I hesitated. But I can hold them, all of them, as proof of something real. And that, somehow, is enough. So here we are. Not perfect, not finished, just together in the only way that ever mattered. And I carry it with me, quietly, every day. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?